On today's show, I'm giving you my full review of Dwellings of Eldervale. Just arriving on people's doorsteps now, this is the new hyped Kickstarter from Breaking Games. The question is, was it worth the wait? Join me on the table and we'll find out more. Ooh, got my back. Hi there, I'm Luke Hector from the Broken Meeple, and if this is your first time checking out the channel, then please check out the rest of the content on this show to find out more about reviews, top 10s, solo modes, you name it, I've done it. See if it's right for you, and hopefully I'll earn your subscription later. And when this game eventually hits retail, if it sounds right for you, then consider acquiring it from zatu.co.uk, where you can get 5% off any items in your basket, including this one, by using my code TBMeeple5 in the corner. See if there's a gap on your shelf that needs filling, and consider acquiring it from them. Dwellings of Eldervale, try saying that really quickly several times, is the new hyped Kickstarter arriving from Breaking Games, generating over $500,000 when it was funding. This should be released in retail form by the end of 2020, but backers are already getting their standard, deluxe and legendary kits at the moment. Now I have the legendary box, which is this huge giant monstrosity here with the extremely nice looking Dreadcrop cover, but I am reviewing this as if it was a retail edition. And I will say that in terms of the extras you get for the deluxe and the legendary bits, it's essentially cosmetic only. Apart from some minor little mini expansion stuff that I think the legendary stuff throws in, it is mainly just cosmetic and a tiny bit of extra variety. The retail version of this contains the vast bulk of what I'm going to be doing in this review. Now, Dwellings of Eldervale does have a lot in its box, so I'll try to get through this as quick as I can. At its core, it's a worker placement game. Players are trying to set up home in Eldervale by building dwellings, but what they will do is they will use their workers to populate a hex map, which expands as the game progresses, in order to acquire magic cards, in order to build more dwellings, but of course also to dodge the way of monsters and other players who might get in your face on a regular basis. You take control of one of 16 playable factions, usually pertaining to one of the 8 different forms of magic that exist in the game: fire, earth, air, water. And with the workers that you have at your disposal, with some minor special abilities pertaining to your faction, you will use these workers to gain resources, to acquire cards, to fight in combat, and generally do what most Euro games have done from a mechanical perspective. All within the theme that you have all this different type of magic going around that focuses on different aspects, like for example an air magic might allow your stuff to fly across the map, a fire magic might be more aggressive, life magic might be better at healing your units, you know, little thematic touches here and there. The worker placement cycle in this game functions very similarly to the Manhattan Project line of games. If you're not aware of this line, basically the idea is that as well as placing a worker out to do an action, you also at different times get to take back your workers and trigger different actions. Players can do this whenever they choose. You could put out all 5 of your workers and then take all 5 of them back, or you could just place out a couple, take them back, place them out, take them back. You know, you could do it in quick succession or in longer successions. Primarily, you will use your workers to gain resources, gems, scrolls, tools, etc. Using these, you will be able to build your dwellings in Eldervale, which will give you combat bonuses, but you'll also be able to acquire adventure cards. These adventure cards pertain to the 8 different styles of magic and give you other ways of scoring points, some special abilities, and some other little cool effects besides. But of course, peace only lasts so long in Eldervale, and eventually you are going to have to roll some dice for combat. Whether it's against the other players or against the giant monsters that happen to be running around Eldervale at the time, you are going to have to get your hands dirty every now and again. This essentially involves the rolling of dice based on what workers, whether it's your basic workers or special workers such as a dragon or wizard or warrior that you might acquire during the game. You compare these values and then you roll dice and see who's got the highest value out of all the dice rolled. This is separated, and then if there's a tie, you go to the next die down, then the next die down, next die down, until eventually somebody breaks the tiebreaker. Play continues on with players building buildings, collecting cards, and fighting each other until eventually either the deck of map tiles runs out, or somebody has built their 6th dwelling, at which point you go through some endgame scoring, and of course, see who's the winner, because of course! So D for duration. Does the game outstay its welcome? Is there too much downtime? How long does it even take? Well, the box says 30 minutes per player. and I believe you can just about manage that if everyone is familiar with the game. The problem is, most of the time they won't be. And I usually find that these games take 30 minutes longer than what is written on the backs. So 3 players will take about 2 hours, 4 players about 2.5, and 5 players an experience I don't want to repeat ever again. The game does go on quite long. You've only got 2 ways that the game can end, and what tends to happen is that they go at similar levels. I've never seen it where somebody's rushed one over the other, because you score points for both of them, but the game forces you to get a certain amount of cards, a certain amount of dwellings, because otherwise you can't score several of the cards you've got. So rather than the game rushing to the end, typically it sort of carries on at a steady pace, and with the turns getting more and more advanced as the game goes on, as you're triggering more and more effects, combats are getting more elaborate, and just the fact that, you know, if you're learning this game, there's quite a fair bit of rules for you to absorb, the game does seem to take a bit longer than what is printed. And of course, you've got to factor the setup time. Although, I'll give this one credit, the setup time is not actually too bad. The longest aspect is having to deal with setting up the map tiles. You've got to separate some, shuffle them, draw a certain amount, put some others back, then mix them up again, dish them out in a certain pattern, making certain that you're only using so many magic elements based on the number of players. There's a little bit of fiddliness with that, but for the most part, and this is aided by the game tray system that they use, for the rest of the setup you can pretty much just go, here's your tray, there's these 2 trays, right, good, we're done. So thankfully those game trays exist because they really do help speed the setup. There can be the occasional problem with downtime, however. As turns get more elaborate, there's certainly times where a turn may take a lot longer than others. Sometimes your turn might literally be, I'll take 2 workers back, plonk those 2 effects, I gather these resources, done. I've done it within about 10 seconds. Another player might have a turn where they place a worker down, spend a bit of time doing their action, then they fight a combat with multiple people, then the combat resolves, and oh yeah, I had a bunch of spell cards that I can cast for free on my turn. Oh yeah, there's 1 or 2 free actions I'll do, or grab that little bonus there, and sometimes you might have a bit of an extended gap before it gets around to your turn. This is one key reason that, to be honest, if I'm playing this game, I'd rather cap it at 3 players. 4 I will play if at least majority of the players are familiar with the game, but 5 was not a fun experience. 5 just took too long. It took too long to finish the game. Combats were happening everywhere. It meant that turns took forever, and it meant that once you did your turn, it could be a long time before it got back round to you. And it just took it to a level that I wasn't particularly comfortable with. I find 3 players is a broken record, the sweet spot. Works pretty well at 2 players, and even the solo didn't take too long either, but more on that in a different category. Moving on to E for ease of play, there's a fair amount of rules dumping that you are going to have to do to players at the start of the game because you can't really explain a lot of this stuff as you go on. But the rulebook itself does a decent amount of a job in order to explain all these rules. There is quite a lot to absorb and there's a reasonable amount of text, but there's also a lot of pictorial examples and the concepts are not overly complex. Once I read through this and had a couple of demo turns, it didn't take too long for me to figure out, oh yeah, this is kind of how this works, this is kind of how this works. And thankfully on the back of the rulebook, they tell you how to put everything in the box, which if you got the deluxe or legendary pledge is an absolute godsend, but even with the retail pledge, it's still handy to know this information. If you want to know what all the abilities done, you've also got a nice appendix as well, which has a few FAQs on it, but for the most part it basically explains how every single card in the game works. And this is really good, actually. I mean, this is one of the best appendices I have seen. It explains every player faction ability, every card of every magic, even how the deluxe monsters work. This is like your Bible when you are playing the game. In terms of the solo rules, you get a little separate book in order to do the solo mode, and this was where things started to lack a bit, as if this was kind of like an afterthought. The rules for the solo mode are okay, but there's a couple of contradictions in some of the pictures that go with the rules there, which forced me to go, huh? Wasn't entirely sure. And 1 or 2 concepts here are kind of hidden away in other paragraphs where you're sort of thinking, well, hang on, what do I do with this particular card? And it kind of all just boils down to do it as you see fit. I'd rather it explained it a little bit more clearly, so the solo mode just had a little bit of extra learning time required, but for the most part, as long as you are familiar with the normal game, you should be able to absorb this relatively well. Do not use this as a way of learning the game for yourself though, because it does function fairly differently from how the normal game plays. Player reference aids, not too bad. They're quite text heavy, so I would have rather maybe a little less text. And for some reason, there are one or two key rules that these things miss out. They go through the steps of battle. Okay, great, you've got a nice battle chart. They go through place a unit and regroup. Great. But they miss out certain things like the special abilities of the special workers. Each one has one ability: flight, aggression, and teleport. They're fairly straightforward rules, but for some reason they're not on the reference aid. I feel that's kind of an important thing to know because your faction board doesn't tell you what that ability does, so if you've forgotten it, you'll forget it. You know, kind of a weird miss on this one, but like I say, these are fairly minor blemishes. T for tactics and strategy. Is there a lot of decent mechanics in the game, and does it keep you thinking? Is there a lot of choices to make? There's certainly a lot of choices to make. You've got a lot of places you can put your workers, different resources to collect. Am I going to go for the cards? Am I going to go grab a dwelling? What am I going to do about this combat here? Because if I go too close to the monster, it charges in. Am I willing to die for what action I need to do? There's quite a fair amount of decision making you need to do. The combat may put off some players though. There's quite a lot of it, and it does revolve around dice. So of course there is that luck aspect, which for a game that can take over 2 hours on a regular basis, could be a bit much for some. Now it can be mitigated. There are ways to add to dice or fix dice or re-roll dice at times, but still at the end of the day you could just be rolling some dice and things hose you. The idea that you only take the highest roll is a good one. It's kind of similar, I think, to how Empires of the Void works, but still you might have 5 dice versus somebody's 1 die. You roll 5 dice, you get nothing but 3s, 2s and 1s. Your opponent gets a single 4 and they win the combat despite the fact the odds were clearly in your favour. And even though I said before that the combat doesn't necessarily cripple you, in the sense of, oh, this combat has completely ruined my entire game, it's still a pretty noticeable hindrance at times. To have, say, 1 or 2 of your workers suddenly go to the underworld after a combat just finished, when you could have regrouped those workers and got some precious resources, because when they go to the underworld, all you get is a sword, which is probably one of the I wouldn't say useless resources in the game, but it certainly has a lot less use than the other resources, believe me, and you don't get to trigger the actions on your cards, which are pretty paramount at times. And I have had times where I've seen players get a little bit like, bummed out because of the combat screwing them over. It's happened to me, it's happened to others. It can be a problem that you have to deal with. Timing is a big part of this game, whether it's trying to get to a dwelling first so that you can build it first on that hex, or whether it's just a case of how many workers do I put out versus how many I regroup. Energy Empire is one of my favourite games of all time, and it uses that same worker placement mechanic. I like it here as well. No rounds, none of this whole everybody collects their workers back. No, if I'm going to put out all 6 of my workers and then take them back, fine. You want to just put out 1 or 2 and take them back? Fine. Depends on the cards you've got, majority-wise at the end of the day, because those cards with special actions that you can trigger, sometimes you just want to trigger them every now and again and it's nice, and you just want to have like kind of a big presence on the board, but then sometimes you want to trigger them as often as you can because it's part of your engine, in which case you need to go place, regroup, place, regroup. You need to do it quite frequently. Different players will do different things and it adds to the differentiation among them. The adventure cards allow for some extra different paths to victory in terms of boosting certain parts of your playstyle, but then of course you've also got the little mini magic cards that have little spells that you can cast in order to have some interesting comborific turns, as you say. However, we'll get onto those in a bit more detail in another category. So A for aesthetics. Does the game look good? Is it nice and pretty? Does it justify the cost? This is a bit more of a tricky one because I've got the Legendary Pledge versus the retail, so it's hard to kind of compare a cost value because I don't know exactly how much they're going to price the retail version. But it's pretty much just cosmetics across the board, and this game definitely gets a bit overproduced as you go through the various tiers. The Legendary Pledge has not only another 8 minis, which is awesome, another 8 monsters, but it also has these sound effects bases that make a noise every time you move the monster. I would be lying if I didn't say I enjoyed this ridiculous gimmick, but it is at the end of the day a gimmick. It's just funny to hear the monster noises. It sort of turns a few heads in the cafe when people hear it, and of course people chuckle at it. But at the end of the day, it's a gimmick, so you do not need the legendary pledge just for those bases. However, it does give you another 8 monsters, which we'll get onto that a bit later, but yeah, that's quite a nice addition. The deluxe pledge essentially adds the minis in general. Normally the monster minis are just standees. This time in the deluxe pledge you get the minis. The minis are really good though. These are some nice models, they look cool, and I'm sure people who want to paint them properly will have a whale of a time doing it. For me, I'm kind of just happy with the way the minis look. They're big, they've got presence, and it works quite nicely. But the rest of the game is all in the retail pledge, and it's pretty cool. This is where the overproduced nature can sometimes come in. The game tray system is fantastic. Everybody can just pick up a tray, dish out a tray, there you go. All your pieces are in there, they're arranged, and all you've got to do is just make certain it's got a resource of each type when the game starts. Nice and simple. The faction boards and all the cards, they've got nice artwork. However, I do think the player boards are a little bit on the cheap side. Most of the trays and everything else and the minis are all in good condition after many plays. The problem is you use the player board as the lid for the player trays, and in doing so you're already starting to see scuff marks and some dents and various things. It's not the toughest cardboard I've ever seen, and you're going to notice this particularly if a certain faction or colour gets played pretty frequently. Everything else though is pretty solid. If you've got the retail version alone, you'll have some decent cardboard chits. You'll still have the wooden meeples with the laser etch printing on them, which is really good. As I said, the trays are in there and the card artwork is the same across the board. If you upgraded to the deluxe version and got the Meeple source resources, then you'll have some very nice little wooden sort of laser printed resources to use. These look amazing. They were definitely worth the upgrade in my opinion. And so overall, the game looks great on the table and certainly justifies like, oh yeah, I've got all these trays and I've got all these pieces. It certainly justifies people staring twice and going, ooh, that looks pretty good. But you are going to have to pay a bit for it. It's not the cheapest game in the world, and you're certainly having to pay quite a bit for those extra minis and the sound effects bases when it comes to the Legendary Pledge. Not to mention, you have a game that's this big if you get the Legendary version. I'm not entirely certain if the retail version is much smaller than this, but I can't imagine it will be much smaller. But yeah, you better think about your storage capacity. Although, I am pleased to say that it just fits on a Kallax shelf. So, like, literally you've got next to no leeway at all, but this will go on your Kallax shelf if you can actually find space to put it somewhere. I for Immersion, and then this is where it takes a bit more of a hit really. I was going into this game thinking, oh yeah, this is going to be such a rich thematic experience, and it kind of is, but it feels like a bit of a thin veneer when you really boil it down. Yes, okay, you've got all these different types of magic, so fire and earth and that. And I went into this thinking, right, so if I specialise in the fire, I'm going to be chucking fireballs, I'm going to be like summoning molten lava pits or something. And then if I go into earth, I'm going to be able to build like command creatures or do really cool stuff. Air, I'll be able to fly. Death, I'll be able to resurrect stuff. And there's a little bit of that there, but there's not a lot. Occasionally you'll come across a card that fits with the magic you're using. It's like, oh, I get to resurrect something. Okay, that makes sense with death. Oh, I do get a little bit of a boost to my combat. Okay, that kind of makes sense with the fire and aggression. But then other times you just get a generic card that gives you resources or points, and it's like, okay, that could have been pretty much anything. And at other times, and this is probably one of my worst aspects of the cards, the vault cards. These are literally just generic cards for points at the end of the game, and not even that many points really. I don't even find them that useful to go for, where you just basically put a treasure tile on it, and depending on what's pictured on it, you get some points. The vault could literally be anything. It is just purely another little mechanical twist to get a few extra points, and I do mean a few. Do not try to make vaults your purpose for the game, because it will not pay off, and it's kind of like, it's just there to bolster a deck which really should have been filled with more fun cards. I mentioned you don't get to chuck a fireball. Well, you do once if you take the magic card Fireball, but the problem is it's a deck of 60 cards, which you will, well, we'll get onto that in the next chapter, but there's one Fireball card in it, or maybe two, I can't remember. So you might go through the whole game and never seen it, but anybody can pick up the Fireball spell, regardless of whether they've touched the fire track for the elemental track. Yes, it's cheaper if you have maxed out in fire, but to be honest, it's not that big of a deal, and chances are if you haven't specialised in fire, you'll simply just ignore the card if you see it. But why is it in the generic magic deck? Why is it not in the fire deck? Why do I not feel that different from other players when I'm trying to do these different elements? If I go max out on death and life, for example, I don't feel a great deal different from another player who's maxed out on air and earth. They might have occasional different cards, but for the most part, it's mainly just a point gathering system. You go through and get the dwellings. Okay, the dwellings give you a little combat boost, and of course they're worth points. The cards are also worth points, and that's kind of just what the elemental track is at the end of the day. A way of getting points. And I would have liked for the theme to just be a little bit stronger with really differentiating out those different magic decks. Now, of course, you've got potentially giant monsters, although if it's standees it's a little less intimidating, and the sound effect bases help with the theme, just to get, even though it's a gimmick, it does help immerse you a little bit more. But definitely this does feel more like a Euro game first and the theme second. Not to say that the theme is pasted on in any regard. They certainly took a time to think, all right, what factions can we use, and will the abilities of the factions gear from them? I mean, certainly if you take, for example, the Chaos faction, one of them looks like it's straight out of an Arkham Horror universe, and the abilities on there kind of go, yeah, that kind of fits with them. And then there's a clericy race, and one of their powers is to get people back from the underworld. So it's like, okay, yeah, the theme is there. I'm not going to say it's pasted, but it's kind of here in places, not there in others, and I just kind of would have liked more of a thematic differentiation with those adventure cards. L for longevity. Does the game have enough variety to keep you coming back for more? Yay and nay, but first the solo mode. This is a highlight actually. I like the solo mode in this. It essentially simulates a two-player game, but it does a very good job of making the AI feel like a human opponent. It's definitely different from how the normal game plays, because essentially the character, in fact I can get you the board, it has its own little board like this, and the idea is that cards will go on the bottom of this board that dictate what actions it could do. It has meeples along the top of each action and certain die values. You roll a die and then it dictates which card it goes after, providing it's got workers there. If there's no workers there, it does a regroup, and there's different rules for that. But this simulates a player very well, because of course you might predict, okay, the player will probably likely do that. I reckon they're going to grab that tile, I better get it before they do. But then they might surprise you by doing something different. That's exactly how this AI functions. You can see what workers they've got left over, you can see the free potential actions they will do, and because this Watcher Meeple follows you around and is kind of like the center point of how you work out the placement of the various things they do, you can make educated guesses as to what the AI will do. You will never be able to fully know what they're going to do. You might think, well, there's a good chance that they will use that card, which means they're going to appear there, which means I'm going to have to fight them in a minute. That could be a bit of a problem, and you might influence your turn for it. But then you might roll something different and they do a completely different action. Again, simulates a human a human player very well, and it was definitely not as much. I thought it was going to be an afterthought, and clearly it's not. Now, in terms of the rest of the variety, it kind of depends on which edition of this game you purchased. If you went all the way to the legendary version like I did, you get 8 extra monsters. And each monster has its own ability, you only use what's in the elements, but if you imagine that normally you have 8 monsters, 1 for each element, you're going to see them repeated quite a lot. I have 16 monsters, and I can chop and change which ones are the various colours I use. That is a lot of variety in those monsters, and I do not regret that aspect of the Legendary Pledge one bit. That I could have done without the sound effects bases and just simply had 8 extra monsters. Although, I would have preferred it that maybe they didn't have a Legendary version in the first place and just simply said, right, Deluxe version gives you another 8 monsters. You know, maybe like gave you 16 monsters and the minis and just upped the price a little bit. The Legendary version kind of just feels like an unnecessary add-on. But in terms of the retail version and like the cards and that, more hit and miss. I mean, yeah, you could argue that there's 8 different types of mana and there's 16 player factions. And yes, the 16 player factions are probably the best form of variety in this game. There's 2 for each type of mana, so even if I decide to play fire and I'm the ogres one week, I might flip it over and be the goblins the next week. And they will have different player abilities. Although the player abilities are nice, but they don't exactly differentiate you to a massive extent. But like I say, 16 player factions, that's pretty good. Can't really fault that. But those adventure cards again, it doesn't seem like there's enough in those decks. I'm already seeing pretty much every card in the game, and that's only after, well, I can't remember exactly how many, but, it's less than 10 plays, so I would say that I'm already seeing all the cards that are in this game. And you see a lot of them on repeat because the first card is a doorway card, and unless you use the variant rule, you have to go through that card, which is just generic engine building. You can opt to say, right, it's at the bottom of the deck from a variant, but, that's a different story. But even so, if I decide, right, I'm going for life mana again, I see the same sort of cards come up that I did the last time I went for life mana. And as I said, you've got some cards that are just wasted on those vaults, and some cards that aren't even that interesting. In fact, they're so uninteresting they never get bought. I can think of several in particular. But you do get some really powerful cards in there, which everybody hunts for, particularly the ones that are powered by orbs, and they're definitely the highlight. I just wish that they were more of them in the decks. The 60 power cards, the magic cards that you can get, which are kind of like generic magic cards that everybody can get, they're really cool. But again, even though there's 60 of them, you tend to see them all in like the first couple of games. I would have liked more of them. I would have liked, an even bigger deck of those cards. Maybe you don't even use so many of them in the game, but most games I think, oh yeah, I'm going to see a polymorph there, I'm going to see that fireball, I'm going to see that flood somewhere. It's just a case of, will somebody cast them? In terms of the monsters, you can even dominate a monster and put it under your control, but there's literally only 3 ways in the game to do it, and 2 of them are tied to specific types of magic. So if you don't play with those bits of magic in the game, there's only 1 card in the game that allows you to dominate a monster, and I was kind of hoping we'd be able to dominate monsters left and right and have them at our beck and call. As such, it's basically just a really cool thing that happens like once in every 25% of your games, like a bit like the Race for the Galaxy War expansion, if you remember that. So my final word on the Dwellings of Eldervale is that this is a fun Euro game with a few blemishes here and there on terms of the theme and the variety. But the flow of play is relatively smooth, even though the downtime and the time length can go a little bit long for my liking, particularly with higher player counts. There is still a solid solo mode though, the production is off the charts in various places, and there's definitely a decent amount of tactics and choices that you have to make based on the flow of the game, while still trying to go down your one strategy of, oh, do I focus on this, do I focus on that? There's definitely a lot to enjoy in Dwellings. It's definitely one I'm going to hang on to, but it does fall a little bit shy of what I would consider to be a distinction level game. And as such, my final rating for Dwellings of Eldervale is a strong 8 out of 10. It's just a little bit shy of a distinction level game because of the flaws that I have with it, but I do not regret my purchase of this at all. It's definitely going to find space somewhere around my collection. I have no idea where, but I'm going to hang on to this and I will enjoy my plays of it in the future. It's just that maybe I went into it with a couple of expectations that weren't necessarily met. Like I say, some of that might be down to me really, but I still think this is a solid game. I think that those of you who are going to get their pledges anytime now, if you haven't already, or are looking to pick it up on retail, will have good fun with this game. Consider how much money you want to spend on the game, whether you're interested in the deluxe minis or the sound effects bases, but honestly, to be honest, you will get pretty much the same amount of enjoyment from this game from just sticking with the retail version as you will the deluxe and legendary. You'll just sacrifice a tiny bit of extra variety here and there. Now, I hope you've been enjoying the content on the Broken Meeple, but I'm not the only one out there producing reviews. I highly suggest that you check out as many opinions as you can on the same game in order to get a range of opinions and ideas to make your purchasing decision. Why don't you check out this channel on the side and see if they're right for you.
Hey gamers, I'm Nick.
I'm Andy.
I'm Caleb.
Josh.
And we are
Core 4 Games.
We break down games into the 4 cores of gaming in our reviews. I also do some strategy videos.
We also have how to play videos as well as playthroughs of some of the most popular board games out there.
Community building videos including interviews and seasonal content.
And I like turtles. No, but we also do top 5 videos and episodic shows showing what's new in the board game world. Also a 2-player playlist as well.
So, if you like our content, go ahead and subscribe to our channel. We would just love to show you all the stuff that we've put together for you. Thanks, guys.
So that's it for me on this episode of the Broken Meeple. If you like what you see and have earned your subscription, hit the avatar to subscribe, hit the bell for future notifications. Until next time, you can check out the most recent upload on the channel or my own personal recommendation based on this video. So take care, and remember as always, it's only a game. Bye for now.